The war was already turning against Germany. Allied bombers filled the sky, cities lay in ruins, and the once invincible Luftwaffe was being torn apart. Factories were burning, civilians were dying, and the Reich's enemies were closing in from every direction. Faced with that reality, Hitler's solution wasn't defense. It wasn't strategy. It was vengeance. Instead of rebuilding his air force or defending his cities, he poured Germany's last resources into the creation of so-called wonder weapons, machines that promised salvation through fear. The result was the V-weapons, the V-1 flying bomb, and the V-2 rocket. They were impressive, they were terrifying, and they were completely useless. Before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we look at history's biggest ideas that should have worked but didn't. The V in V-weapons stood for Vergeltungswaffe, meaning vengeance weapon. The name says everything about their purpose. They weren't built to win the war. They were built to punish. By 1943, Germany was losing ground on every front. The Allies had taken North Africa. The Soviets had crushed the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad, and Allied bombers were reducing German cities to rubble night after night. Hitler needed a miracle not to win, but to prove to his people and himself that Germany still had power. That miracle became a fantasy made of steel and fire. The V-1 was a crude, pilotless jet bombwatt we'd now call a cruise missile. It looked like a small aircraft with a pulsajet engine strapped on top, and it flew just fast enough to outrun most Allied fighters. When its engine cut out, it meant one thing: it was about to fall and explode. Londoners learned that silence in the sky was the sound of death. The V-2 was even more advanced, a liquid-fueled ballistic missile that rose beyond the atmosphere before falling at supersonic speed. It was the world's first long-range rocket weapon. It could not be intercepted, could not be tracked, and when it hit, it killed indiscriminately. On paper, these were revolutionary technologies decades ahead of their time. But in practice, they were disasters. Each missile cost more to produce than the damage it caused. The V-1 could carry only a small warhead, often missing its target entirely. The V-2 was even worse. Its guidance system was primitive, and its accuracy depended on luck. The missiles were aimed at cities, not military bases or factories, because that was all they could reliably hit. They were terror weapons, not tools of war. Hitler didn't care. He saw them as symbols. He believed that if he could rain destruction on London, it would break British morale and force Churchill to negotiate peace. It was a delusion born of desperation. The same dictator who had once orchestrated lightning-fast conquests was now launching rockets into the sky, hoping fear alone could win a war. The project consumed resources Germany could not afford to waste. Thousands of engineers, technicians, and laborers were pulled from critical arms production to work on the missile program. Factories that should have been producing tanks and planes were redirected to manufacture rocket parts. The cost of one V-2 rocket equaled the cost of building an entire fighter plane one that could have actually defended German airspace. And Hitler's obsession with secrecy made it worse. The rockets were built in underground tunnels and hidden facilities, requiring massive amounts of concrete, fuel, and forced labor. That forced labor came from concentration camps. The VO weapons were built in the Mittelwerk underground complex, where tens of thousands of enslaved prisoners were worked to death. Starved, beaten, and executed for the smallest mistakes. They died in greater numbers than the V-2 South ever killed in Britain. The miracle weapon was a death factory on both ends, killing those who built it and those it targeted. By 1944, the program had grown into one of the largest industrial projects in the Third Reich. It was driven by fear, not logic. The Luftwaffe's generals begged for resources to mass-produce jet fighters like the Me-262, which could have challenged Allied bombing raids. But Hitler dismissed them. He believed defensive weapons were weak. He wanted something that looked powerful, something that could strike back. In his mind, image mattered more than effect. The V-weapons became that imageless spectacle of technical brilliance, masking total strategic stupidity. Each launch was a logistical nightmare. The V-1 South were fired from ramp sites across northern France, many of which were quickly bombed by the Allies. The V-2 South required specialized fuel and complex transport convoys that were easy to spot from the air. Every missile launched represented a small miracle of coordination and a massive waste of effort. They hit cities randomly, causing destruction but never altering the course of the war. London was hit hundreds of times, and Antwerp suffered even worse. But the effect was psychological, not military. The British adapted quickly, improving warning systems, dispersing resources, and refusing to panic. The V in V weapons was supposed to stand for vengeance, but it ended up standing for vanity. The irony was that the technology itself was extraordinary. The engineers behind the program, led by Wernher von Braun, were visionaries. Their work laid the foundation for the space age, but in 1944, their rockets were being used not to explore the heavens, but to slaughter civilians. Even von Braun privately admitted that the rockets were useless for war. When asked about their purpose, he said, "Our work should have been for the stars, not for destruction." The cost of the program was astronomical. The V2 project alone consumed more than 500 million Reichsmarks, the equivalent of billions of dollars today. It required rare metals, precision instruments, and chemical fuel that could have powered thousands of aircraft. For every rocket that reached London, several exploded on the launch pad or crashed shortly after takeoff. Hitler's vision of a technological revolution was bleeding his own army dry. By the time the weapons were deployed, the war was already lost. The Allies were advancing from the west, the Soviets from the east, and Germany's cities were burning. The rockets that Hitler believed would turn the tide became symbols of futility. Each one launched into the sky like a flare marking the Reich's final hours. Yet Hitler couldn't stop. The V weapons weren't military tools anymore. They were emotional ones. They gave him the illusion of control, a way to pretend he was still striking back. Every explosion in London was proof, at least to him, that Germany was still fighting, still feared, still relevant. It was theater, not war. Inside the Reich, propaganda turned these failures into triumphs. Films showed rockets launching in slow motion, accompanied by heroic music, and slogans about Germany's vengeance. Civilians, starving and bombed, were told that salvation would come from these new technologies. But even the most loyal Germans began to doubt. They could see that the rockets weren't stopping the Allied bombers overhead. They could hear the explosions in their own streets. The miracle weapons were just another lie. In the end, the V weapons accomplished nothing but destruction. They didn't slow the Allies, didn't save Germany, and didn't change the outcome of the war. They only diverted the talent and resources that might have prolonged the defense. The scientists who designed them survived to see their inventions used for something entirely different: exploration, instead of annihilation. But for the men who funded them, the rockets were just another monument to denial. The V weapons were born out of pride, not necessity. They were the product of a leader who refused to face reality, who believed fear could replace strategy. In a war defined by scale and logistics, Hitler had chosen symbolism. And as the Allies closed in, those symbols became Germany's most expensive mistake. The war was burning to its end. The Reich had no more miracles left to summon. But deep underground, in cold tunnels filled with the echoes of slave labor and unfinished rockets, Hitler's fantasy of vengeance was still alive, waiting for its chance to rise into the sky one last time. While Hitler poured Germany's last reserves into his rockets of vengeance, another machine, one that could have changed the course of the war, was left neglected in hangars and half-finished factories. It wasn't a fantasy weapon. It wasn't designed to terrorize civilians. It was a jet, the Messerschmitt Me-262 history's first operational jet fighter. It could fly faster than any Allied aircraft, climb higher, and strike harder. It was the only weapon that might have stopped the destruction raining from the skies. But it never got the chance. The tragedy of the Me-262 wasn't that it failed. It was that it was never allowed to succeed. By 1943, Germany had fallen far behind in the air war. The skies over the Reich belonged to the Allies. American B-17s and B-24s bombed German cities and industrial centers daily, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters that could reach Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Nazi military power, was collapsing. Its pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and its planes were outnumbered and outclassed. German air defense was on life support. The Me-262 could have changed that. It was the result of years of research into jet propulsion technology that no other nation had yet mastered. Powered by two Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines, the Me-262 could fly at nearly 900 kilometers per hour. Far beyond the reach of any Allied piston engine fighter, It could climb to altitudes where bombers were most vulnerable and strike with devastating speed. A squadron of Me-262s could have torn apart entire bomber formations before they reached their targets, but the jet never reached those numbers. The potential was there, but the will and the resources were not. The problem began at the top. Hitler didn't understand the jet's strategic value. When he first saw the Me-262 demonstrated, he wasn't impressed by its speed or its performance. He fixated on its payload. To him, a fighter was a defensive weapon and defense meant weakness. He wanted offense. He demanded that the Me-260 to be converted into a blitz bomber, a fast attack plane capable of carrying bombs. The Luftwaffe generals protested, arguing that the aircraft's real value lay in air superiority, not bombing. But Hitler overruled them. He didn't want to stop the Allies from bombing Germany. He wanted to strike back. The decision crippled the program. Engineers had to redesign the aircraft to carry bombs, delaying production by months. Factories that could have been producing fighters were instead making rockets and launch equipment for the VW program. Jet engines required advanced alloys and precision. Machining resources already in short supply and now diverted to the missile program. Even high-octane aviation fuel needed for the jets was being used to power V-1 launchers. The Luftwaffe was starved while the rocket scientists feasted. By mid-1944, when the first Me-262 units finally entered service, it was already too late. Germany's fuel supplies were collapsing, its pilots were inexperienced, and its production lines were constantly bombed. The jets that did reach the front were remarkable but few in number, often grounded for lack of fuel or spare parts. They could appear like ghosts in the sky, strike once, and vanish, but they couldn't change the outcome of the war. It was a cruel irony. The same government that had spent years perfecting the art of blitzkrieg speed, coordination, precision, now sabotaged itself with obsession and ego. Hitler's fixation on spectacle destroyed the practical. He wanted weapons that looked powerful on film, not those that could win battles. Rockets launching into the night sky fit his image of revenge. Silent, invisible jets defending German skies did not. The internal politics of the Nazi state made it worse. The weapons industry was a battlefield of personal ambition. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, was caught between Hitler's demands and the military's desperation. Werner von Braun and the rocket engineers had direct access to Hitler and his imagination. Their sleek, futuristic missiles promised him miracle victories. The Me-262, on the other hand, was a fighter plane, a tool of defense, not glory. So while Speer struggled to allocate dwindling resources, Hitler's attention and money went into the VO program. The result was absurd. While entire cities were burning under Allied bombs, factories that could have been producing hundreds of Me-262s were instead building missiles that would kill civilians in London. A symbolic gesture that achieved nothing. Allied commanders, when they first encountered the Me-262 in combat, recognized instantly what it meant. They called it the jet menace. A single Me-262 could slice through a bomber formation before anyone could react. Its 30mm cannons could tear apart even the heaviest aircraft. Pilots reported watching the jet appear suddenly, fire once, and disappear before they could turn their planes. It was a glimpse of the future of air combat. But there were never enough of them. At most, only about 200 Me-262s saw meaningful action at a time when the Allies were flying thousands of bombers and fighters daily. Many jets were destroyed on the ground before ever taking off. They required long runways, and the Luftwaffe's airfields were constantly under attack. Pilots had to take off and land while Allied fighters circled overhead. Some were killed seconds after leaving the runway. Others were captured intact by advancing Allied troop souvenirs of what might have been Germans had the technology years before anyone else. The British Gloucester Meteor and the American P-8 Shooting Star were still in early testing when the Me-262 was flying combat missions. If Germany had deployed the jet in 1943 instead of 1944, if it had been prioritized over Raucous the Air War, could have been very different. The Allied bomber offensive might have been slowed or even halted. German industry might have had time to recover. The Reich might have held out longer. But by the time Hitler realized his mistake, his air force was already dead. The failure wasn't technical, it was psychological. The Nazi regime was addicted to the idea of the wonder weapon, the miracle that would change everything overnight. They believed technology could replace strategy. They poured resources into fantasies while neglecting the simple, brutal arithmetic of war. Production, supply, manpower. 100 jets in the air would have done more than 1,000 rockets fired into the dark. But Hitler couldn't see that. By the winter of 1944, the Allies owned the skies completely. The bombers came in waves, day and night, flattening cities, oil plants, and rail lines. Every hour that passed without jet fighters in the air meant more factories destroyed, more fuel lost, more civilians killed. Germany's war machine was collapsing under its own arrogance. The Luftwaffe was dying not for lack of skill, but for lack of support. Pilots who flew the Me-262 knew it. They described the aircraft as both a triumph and a tragedy, a weapon that could have saved their comrades if only it had come sooner. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top fighter aces, called it the plane that could have won the air war. But the chance was gone. The factories were gone, the fuel was gone, and the V-2 South were still flying, burning through resources while cities burned around them. In the end, Germany's lead in jet technology was wasted not by defeat, but by mismanagement. The Me-262 became a symbol of what the Reich could have done if it had chosen logic over pride, defense over vengeance, reality over fantasy. But Hitler's Germany was never capable of that kind of clarity. The same ego that had driven him to start the war now blinded him to the possibility of saving what was left. The Luftwaffe didn't just lose the skies, it was abandoned by its own leader. As Allied planes roamed over a dying nation, the last of the German jets flew on fumes, outnumbered and unsupported, into a war that no longer had purpose. The dream of air supremacy that had once defined Hitler's empire ended not in glory, but in smoke, ruin, and silence. The rockets had their vengeance. The jets never had their chance. The V-2 rocket was supposed to be the ultimate weapon. It was faster than sound, impossible to intercept, and capable of striking a city hundreds of miles away. To the people who designed it, it represented the pinnacle of human engineering, a glimpse into the future. But to the German war effort, it was a disaster. It was a bomb with no tactical value, an engineering miracle that achieved almost nothing at an astronomical cost. By the time the first V-2 South were launched in 1944, Germany was already dying. The Allies had invaded France, Soviet armies were pushing from the east, and German cities were being bombed to rubble. What Hitler needed were weapons that could defend his empire, tanks to hold the front lines, artillery to stop Soviet advances, anti-aircraft guns to protect his cities. Instead, he poured everything into rockets that could not change the course of the war. The V-2 carried a warhead of about 1 ton of explosives, roughly the same as a medium bomber S payload. It could destroy a house, devastate a city block, and kill civilians unlucky enough to be nearby. But in military terms, it was useless. It couldn't destroy bridges, factories, or hardened targets. It couldn't be aimed precisely enough to hit railways or troop concentrations. Its impact zone was measured in kilometers, not meters. At best, it was a terror weapon, not a strategic one. Each rocket cost the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's money. Each launch required specialized equipment, trained crews, and enormous quantities of liquid oxygen and ethanol fuel materials that were already in short supply. For the same cost as one V-2, Germany could have built dozens of field guns, hundreds of rifles, or several tanks. The 5.2's only advantage was psychological, and even that effect was short-lived. The rocket's accuracy was abysmal. It had no onboard guidance system in the modern sense, only gyroscopes and timers that could roughly control its path. Once launched, it followed a fixed trajectory. There was no way to adjust its aim. Many rockets missed their targets entirely, crashing into empty fields or exploding in rural areas. London and Antwerp were the primary targets, but even those cities absorbed hits that were more random than deliberate. The rockets created fear, but not paralysis. The British quickly adapted. Civil defense systems improved, evacuation zones were enforced, and radar networks tracked launches from Europe. The attacks caused horror, but not disruption. Factories kept running. Morale stayed high. For every rocket that struck, the Allies produced another 100 bombers in return. The balance of destruction was hopelessly one. Inside Germany, some military leaders recognized this early. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, knew the rockets were a financial sinkhole. He warned that the V-2 program consumed critical materials, aluminum, steel, copper, and fuel that could have been used to rebuild the Luftwaffe or expand tank production. Every rocket launched meant another Panzer not built, another flak gun never produced, another convoy left unprotected. But Hitler didn't listen. The rockets had captured his imagination. He saw them as symbols of German genius and vengeance, proof that his Reich could still strike even as it was being crushed. To him, the explosions in London were worth any price. They were proof that Germany could still make the world tremble. That illusion mattered more than logic. In reality, the V-2 was a logistical nightmare. The fuel had to be mixed in exact ratios and kept at freezing temperatures. The engines were so fragile that even a minor miscalculation could cause an explosion on the launch pad. The production process was so complex that entire factories had to be built underground to protect them from Allied bombers. Thousands of slave laborers from concentration camps were forced to build the rockets in horrific conditions, starved, beaten, and worked to death. More people died building the V-2 than were ever killed by it. The middlework tunnels, deep beneath the Harz Mountains, became the grave of the so-called miracle weapon. Prisoners were forced to work 16-hour shifts in darkness, often chained to their stations. Disease, malnutrition, and execution were routine. When production slowed, guards shot workers on the spot. The human cost of each rocket was measured in corpses long before it ever left the ground. Even among the engineers, the moral divide was clear. Werner von Braun, the program's brilliant chief engineer, later claimed he was only interested in rocketry, not politics. But his rockets were used to kill civilians, and his designs were built on the backs of prisoners. His genius had been consumed by a regime that valued revenge more than reason. The V-2 wasn't just a military failure, it was a moral one. From a tactical standpoint, the weapon achieved nothing. Between 1944 and 1945, over 3,000 V-2 South were launched at Allied cities. They killed around 9,000 people, mostly civilians. In comparison, the Allied bombing campaigns killed tens of thousands of Germans every month and destroyed the industrial capacity of the Reich. The scale was entirely lopsided. The resources used on the V-2 could have produced enough anti-aircraft guns to significantly reduce Allied bombing losses, or enough tanks to delay Soviet advances. Instead, those materials were wasted on explosions that achieved nothing but propaganda. The absurdity of the project became apparent even to the officers operating it. The rocket crews knew they were launching weapons that didn't matter. They watched their country collapsing around them while they loaded fuel into machines designed for vengeance, not victory. Every launch was followed by reports of success, but success had no meaning anymore. There was no strategy, no plan, only motion for its own sake. When the Allies advanced into Germany, they found the remnants of the program scattered across forests and tunnels, half-finished rockets, burned-out factories, and the corpses of thousands of slave workers. What they discovered wasn't a super weapon, it was a monument to failure. The V-2 had consumed the last of Germany's industrial strength and returned nothing. The weapon's real legacy wouldn't be felt in war, but in peace. The technology behind the V-2 became the foundation for the post-war space. Programs in both the United States and the Soviet Union, the same rocket that had killed civilians in London would one day send humans to space. But in 1944, it was simply the costliest mistake in the history of warfare. The tragedy wasn't just in the waste, it was in the blindness. Germany, a nation capable of producing the most advanced jet aircraft in the world, the most skilled engineers, and the most disciplined soldiers, had spent its dying breath on a weapon that couldn't aim, couldn't win, and couldn't change anything. The V-2 was the perfect reflection of the regime that built it. Grand in vision, empty in purpose. A machine that reached the edge of space but failed to touch reality. By the time the last rockets were fired in early 1945, the Allies were already inside Germany. The cities they were meant to defend no longer existed. The factories were ruins. The people were starving. Hitler still demanded more launches, still dreamed of vengeance, but the truth was simple. The rockets were falling from the sky, and so was his empire. The miracle weapon had done what all of Hitler's miracles did, consumed everything and left nothing behind. The story of the V-weapons isn't just about wasted steel and fuel, it's about wasted lives. Beneath the surface of Germany's war machine, under the mountains of the Harz region, thousands of people were dying in the dark. They were starved, beaten, and worked to death, not for a weapon that could change the war, but for one that existed only to satisfy a dictator's obsession with revenge. The underground tunnels at Middlework, where the V-2 rockets were built, became one of the most brutal industrial graveyards in history. When the Allied bombing campaign began devastating Germany's surface factories in 1943, the Nazi regime moved rocket production underground. The Middlework complex, dug into the Konstein Mountain near Nordhausen, became the center of V-2 manufacturing. It was a sprawling labyrinth miles of tunnels filled with machinery, assembly lines, and the stench of death. The workforce wasn't made up of engineers or trained mechanics. It was composed almost entirely of concentration camp prisoners and slave laborers. The prisoners came from across occupied Europe. Political dissidents, captured resistance members, Jews, Poles, Russians, and French civilians. They were transferred from Buchenwald concentration camp to a subcamp known as Mittelbudora, built specifically to feed the rocket program with human labor. For them, the factory was both workplace and death sentence. Conditions in the tunnels were beyond comprehension. The air was thick with dust, fumes, and the smell of rotting flesh. There was no ventilation, no sunlight, and no sanitation. The prisoners slept in the same tunnels where they worked, often on the bare rock floor, surrounded by rats and their own waste. The work never stopped. The factory operated 24 hours a day in 2 shifts, and the prisoners were forced to labor for up to 16 hours at a time. Food was almost non-existent thin soup, stale bread, and sometimes nothing at all. Water came from contaminated puddles that collected in the tunnel floor. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery claimed thousands of lives. Those too weak to work were beaten, hanged, or shot. The guards saw them not as people, but as tools, expendable parts of the machinery of vengeance. By the end of the war, it's estimated that between 20,000 and 25,000 prisoners died at Middlework, either from exhaustion, starvation, disease, or execution. To put that number in perspective, the V-2 rockets killed about 9,000 people in their attacks on London and Antwerp. In simple arithmetic, more people died making the weapon than were ever killed by it. It was an equation that revealed everything about the insanity of the project. The prisoners' deaths weren't accidents. They were built into the system. The SS officers who managed the camp saw death as a form of efficiency one body used up. Another brought in. Trains arrived daily from Buchenwald, carrying replacements for the dead. The average life expectancy of a prisoner at Middlework was less than 3 months. The tunnels were built on human bodies, and the factory floor was soaked with the sweat and blood of the enslaved. Even among Nazi officials, there were moments of recognition that this system was self-destructive. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, visited the site and admitted later that he was horrified by what he saw. But he did nothing to stop it. He rationalized it as a wartime necessity. In reality, it was madness disguised as production. The regime had chosen to spend its most valuable resource, human labor, on a weapon that offered no strategic return. The irony is that these same prisoners could have been used to build fortifications, to repair railways, to produce weapons that might actually have helped defend Germany, but the V-weapon program had priority. It was Hitler's personal obsession, and no one dared question it. Even as the front collapsed and cities burned, the regime continued to divert manpower to the tunnels. Skilled workers were sent underground to assemble rockets, while German civilians dug trenches with bare hands to resist the advancing Soviets. The cruelty of Middlework wasn't hidden from those at the top. Engineers like Werner von Braun and Arthur Rudolph, who oversaw rocket design and production, regularly inspected the tunnels. They saw the corpses hanging from cranes, the men too weak to stand, the beatings carried out in plain sight. Von Braun later claimed he was powerless to intervene, that he was a scientist, not a politician. But his silence was complicity. His designs were built on the suffering of thousands. The SS officers running the camp kept meticulous records of production quotas and death rates. When output fell, they increased punishments. Hangings became public, carried out in front of the work crews to remind them what failure meant. Prisoners were forced to watch as their friends and cellmates were executed, then ordered back to work beside the bodies. The message was clear. The rockets mattered more than the people who built them. For the Nazi regime, this wasn't just cruelty, it was ideology. The V-weapons were seen as a symbol of racial and technological superiority. The slaves who built them were subhuman, their deaths irrelevant compared to the glory of German science. But the reality was the opposite. The rockets, built by dying men, were monuments to Germany's collapse, not its genius. Each launch was paid for with blood, each explosion in London echoing the screams from underground tunnels hundreds of miles away. Logistically, the system made no sense. The use of slave labor slowed production. The workers were malnourished and untrained, and they sabotaged rockets whenever they could. Many deliberately miswired components or damaged fuel lines, risking death to prevent the weapons from being used. A significant number of V-2 rockets exploded shortly after launch, not because of technical flaws, but because of quiet acts of resistance carried out by men who knew they would die anyway. In this way, Mittelwerk became not just a factory, but a battlefield of wills, the regime's obsession with vengeance against the prisoners' last fragments of humanity. The SS killed anyone caught sabotaging a rocket, but the defiance never stopped. Even in the darkest, most hopeless place, people still found a way to fight back. By 1945, the tunnels were littered with half-finished rockets and decomposing bodies. The Allies discovered the site in the final months of the war, uncovering what they later described as hell under the earth. They found racks of completed missiles, fuel tanks, and assembly lines built directly above piles of corpses. The scale of the death stunned even hardened soldiers. One U.S. officer wrote, "The weapon that could reach the stars was built in a place that had already become the grave of humanity." The labor that might have built defenses, fed production lines, or repaired bombed cities had been squandered underground. The men and women who might have produced the tools to defend Germany were consumed by a project that could only destroy. Was a system driven by one man's ego, a regime so blinded by ideology that it treated vengeance as more valuable than life itself. The Mittelwerk tunnels remain one of the clearest symbols of the Third Reich's moral and strategic collapse. Beneath the illusion of progress, the rockets, the science, the talk of wonder weapons, was nothing but cruelty, waste, and death. The Nazi state had taken some of the most brilliant engineering minds in the world, the last of its industrial power, and an army of slaves, and used them to build machines that achieved nothing. The rockets that rose into the night sky were not symbols of German strength. They were monuments to how far the regime had fallen, machines built for revenge, powered by suffering, launched from the graves of their makers. By the time the first V-1 South and V-2 South began to fall on London, Germany was already finished. Its armies were retreating on every front, its cities were ashes, and its factories lay in ruins. What kept the rockets flying wasn't strategy, it was denial. The V-weapon project wasn't born out of vision. It was born out of desperation. It was the last fantasy of a dictator who couldn't face reality. Hitler's dream of vengeance had replaced every rational form of warfare. By 1944, the Nazi regime had ceased to think in military terms. It thought in symbols. The rockets were meant to prove that Germany could still strike, still terrify, still matter. They were a psychological statement disguised as a military plan. The Reich's resources were nearly gone, yet what remained was poured into a project that did nothing to stop its enemies. The VO weapons consumed everything: money, fuel, labor, time, and lives. They didn't protect German skies. They didn't slow the Allied advance. They didn't save a single city. Instead, they burned through what little was left of the nation's strength. Every rocket launched into the sky represented another hole in Germany's defenses. Another train that didn't carry ammunition to the front. Another aircraft that would never leave the ground. Hitler's inner circle knew it. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, admitted after the war that the VO weapon program had been a colossal waste. He estimated that the same resources could have built tens of thousands of anti-aircraft guns, enough to seriously challenge the Allied bombing campaign. Instead, those guns were never made. The Luftwaffe's pilots flew with empty fuel tanks. Its airfields lay in ruins, and German cities were flattened one by one, while Hitler obsessed over his miracle weapons. The Allies noticed, too. Their intelligence reports recorded that the German rocket attacks caused fear, but not disruption. In London, people adapted. They learned to live with the sound of engines cutting out overhead, with the sudden silence before the blast. The rockets caused tragedy, but not paralysis. The British war machine never slowed down. Factories kept producing, soldiers kept shipping out, and morale, though shaken, never collapsed. The so-called vengeance weapons had no measurable effect on the outcome of the war. Inside Germany, though, the propaganda machine continued to present them as the last hope. Films showed the sleek rockets launching into the night, promising revenge for every Allied bomb that fell on Berlin. But the people watching those films could hear the bombs themselves. They could see the rubble outside their theaters. They knew that the miracle wasn't coming. The V-weapons were a lie told to a starving nation, a story of power in a time of helplessness. The men who worked on the rockets understood the truth better than anyone. The engineers, the officers, even the soldiers operating the launch sites knew the war was lost. They saw the Allies advancing, their supplies shrinking, their cities burning. Yet they kept building and launching because they were ordered to, because Hitler demanded one more symbol of defiance. The rockets became the regime's last gesture of final act of self-destruction, masquerading as strength. By late 1944, the entire program had become a logistical absurdity. The launch sites had to be constantly rebuilt after Allied air raids. Fuel convoys were attacked by fighters. Components were scattered across Europe, assembled in secret, and moved at night. Thousands of workers and prisoners died just transporting the rockets to their launch positions. The Germans were fighting gravity, time, and reality all at once. Even when the rockets launched successfully, the results were meaningless. Each V-2 carried a single ton of explosives. The Allies dropped thousands of tons every day. For the cost of one V-2 rocket, the Allies could build an entire squadron of bombers. The scale of destruction was not even comparable. The rockets were spectacular, but war isn't about spectacle, it's about numbers, logistics, and endurance. Germany had lost all three. What made it worse was that the V-weapons distracted the regime from real defense. The Me-262 jet fighter could have challenged Allied bombers, but it was starved of resources. Anti-aircraft production was gutted. The army on the Eastern Front begged for tanks and ammunition, but their requests were ignored. The V-weapon program swallowed everything. Hitler believed that terror would replace tactics, that the mere existence of a miracle weapon would change the tide of war. It didn't. It only hastened the collapse. When the Allied armies reached Germany in 1945, they found the remnants of the program scattered across the countryside. Underground tunnels filled with unfinished rockets, laboratories abandoned in panic, and rail lines clogged with broken equipment. The Reich had exhausted itself chasing a fantasy. In the final months, Hitler still demanded new versions, bigger rockets. Longer ranges, faster speeds, but his empire no longer existed to build them. The VOE pans became the perfect symbol of what the Third Reich had become. Technologically advanced but strategically hollow, brilliant in design but bankrupt in purpose. The same nation that had pioneered jet propulsion, rocketry, and advanced engineering used those innovations not to save itself, but to feed its own delusion. The rockets weren't tools of war. They were expressions of desperation. Even among Hitler's generals, frustration turned to despair. Field Marshal Keitel reportedly called the rockets a luxury we can no longer afford. Others called them the last toy of a madman. But Hitler didn't care. He clung to the rockets as proof that Germany still had fight left, that his vision still mattered. Each launch was a defiant gesture against a world that had already moved beyond him. By the spring of 1945, when Soviet troops were closing in on Berlin, the rockets were still being fired pointlessly, almost ritualistically. They no longer had military meaning. They were monuments to a delusion that refused to die. The factories that built them were buried, the workers dead or captured, but the idea persisted until the very end. The total cost of the program is difficult to measure, but historians estimate it consumed the resources equivalent to tens of thousands of aircraft, or millions of rifles. For that price, Germany received a weapon that killed fewer civilians than a single night of Allied bombing. It was, in every measurable way, a failure. And yet, within that failure was a strange kind of brilliance. The technology that came out of the V-weapon program, its engines, its fuel systems, its guidance controls would later shape the modern world. The same men who built rockets for Hitler were soon building them for the United States and the Soviet Union. The V-2 became the ancestor of the space age. But in its original form, it was never a triumph of progress. It was the ultimate proof of how progress can be corrupted. In 1944, the rockets had been built for revenge, not for exploration. They were born from hatred, not curiosity. They carried the weight of a dying empire, not the promise of the future. And that S what makes the VOE pens one of the most haunting symbols of the war. Not because of what they achieved, but because of what they wasted. When Germany needed defense, it built vengeance. When it needed strategy, it built spectacle. And when it needed survival, it built death. The VO weapons rose into the sky like arrows of pride, burning bright for a moment, before vanishing into silence, leaving behind only smoke, rubble, and the echo of what might have been